I never thought my life would crumble on a Tuesday afternoon in a gleaming medical office in downtown Chicago. My name is Arthur Sterling, and I'm 71 years old. I spent nearly 4 decades working maintenance on the Union Pacific Railway lines, and I always considered myself a simple man, a man with calloused hands, accustomed to the biting cold of Illinois winters and the satisfaction that comes from honest work. The kind of work where you can see what you've accomplished at the end of the day, where bolts tightened and rails aligned means something real and tangible. I married Grace back in 1978. She was my safe harbor, the woman who made the best stew in all of Lincoln Park, the one who greeted me with a smile even when I came home exhausted and covered in grease. We built our life together in a modest but solid house in Bridgeport, one of those old Chicago neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone, and you can still find that sense of community that seems to be disappearing everywhere else. We had 2 children together, Brandon and Sarah. Brandon is 39 now, and Sarah just turned 34. For most of my life, I believed with everything in me that we were the picture of the perfect American family. I really did. I thought we had it all figured out. Looking back now, I realize how naive that was, how blind I was to what was really happening under my own roof. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because this story needs to be told properly. It needs to be understood in all its ugliness and all its pain, because maybe, just maybe, someone out there is going through something similar and needs to hear that they're not alone, that they're not crazy for feeling something is wrong. Everything started to change about 2 years ago. Grace was driving home from her book club meeting on Lakeshore Drive. It was one of those beautiful Chicago evenings in late spring when the lake looks almost peaceful and the city skyline catches the setting sun. She had made that drive 1,000 times before, but that night a delivery truck ran a red light at the intersection near Oak Street Beach. The impact was devastating. When I got the call from the hospital, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. They told me she was alive, but those first few hours in the emergency room were the longest of my life. I paced those sterile hallways, drinking burnt coffee from paper cups, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. Grace survived. Thank God she survived, but the head trauma left deep scars. The doctors explained it to me in their clinical language, talking about traumatic brain injuries and memory loss and cognitive impairment. But what it really meant was that my Grace, the woman who organized our life with military precision, who never forgot a birthday or an anniversary, who could remember conversations from decades ago word for word, started to lose herself. At first, it was small things. She would forget if she had already made coffee in the morning. She would look for her keys for 20 minutes when they were right there on the kitchen counter where she always kept them. She would repeat the same story to me twice in one evening, having completely forgotten that she had just told me. But then it got worse. There were days when she would look at me with confusion in her eyes, and I could see her struggling to place my face, to remember who I was. Those moments destroyed me, absolutely destroyed me. Imagine spending more than 40 years with someone, building a whole life together, and then watching them struggle to remember your name, watching the recognition flicker in and out like a faulty light bulb. Some days, she was almost her old self. sharp and present. Other days, it was like she was lost in a fog, unreachable. The medical bills started piling up immediately. Insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough. Grace needed therapy, medication, follow-up appointments with specialists. I was already 69, officially retired from the railway, but I couldn't afford to actually stop working. I started taking on contract jobs, maintenance work at apartment buildings, anything I could find. I was gone from the house more than I was there, working 12-hour days sometimes, coming home so tired I could barely stand. But I told myself it was necessary. I told myself I was doing what a man does, taking care of his family, providing for his wife when she needed me most. What I didn't realize, what I was too exhausted and too focused on keeping us afloat financially to see, was that the real danger wasn't the medical bills or the memory loss. The danger was sleeping in the bedroom down the hall. Brandon, my oldest child, had always been a difficult kid. I don't mean that in a cruel way, but it's the truth. From the time he was young, things were always someone else's fault. If he failed a test, it was because the teacher had it out for him. If he lost a job, it was because his boss was incompetent or his co-workers were jealous. He went through his 20s and 30s bouncing from one thing to another, never quite finding his footing. Meanwhile, Sarah had gotten her degree in architecture, built a solid career, married a good man, started her own life. The difference between them was stark, and I think Brandon resented that, resented her success, resented that we were proud of her. When Grace had her accident and her condition became clear, Brandon called me about 3 weeks later. He was living in some apartment in Pilsen at the time, struggling to make rent as far as I knew. He told me he wanted to move back home to help take care of his mother. He said it was time for him to step up, to be there for family. I remember the conversation so clearly. I was standing in our kitchen, looking out at Grace sitting in the backyard, staring at nothing, and I felt this surge of hope. Maybe this tragedy would be the thing that finally brought out the best in my son. Maybe he would finally grow up and become the man I always hoped he would be. I told him yes immediately. I told him his old room was waiting for him. I even said something stupid like it would be good to have him home, that his mother needed family around her. God, I was such a fool, such a blind, hopeful fool. Brandon moved back in about a week later. At first, things seemed okay. He was around during the day while I was at work. He would tell me he had helped Grace with her medication, made her lunch, kept her company. I would come home, and he would give me updates on her day, and I was grateful, genuinely grateful. I even bragged about him to the guys at Miller's Pub, where some of us old railway workers still meet up for drinks. I told them my boy had finally found his purpose, that he was becoming a real man by taking care of his mother. They clapped me on the back and bought me rounds, and I felt proud. Before I continue, I'm really curious, where are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you're finding value in this story, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps me keep sharing these experiences with all of you. Looking back now, the signs were all there. I just didn't want to see them. Or maybe I was too tired to see them properly. Grace started acting different around Brandon. I noticed it, but I explained it away. When he would walk into a room, her whole body would tense up. Her shoulders would hunch forward like she was trying to make herself smaller, invisible. If he spoke to her, even just to ask if she wanted water or something simple like that, she would jump slightly startled. I attributed all of this to her confusion, to her memory problems making her disoriented and easily frightened. I told myself she was just struggling to place who he was, that the brain injury made her nervous around everyone. But there were other things, too. Things I should have questioned more seriously. Sometimes I would come home and find Grace in odd places. Once she was sitting in the upstairs bathroom with the door closed, but not locked, just sitting on the edge of the tub in the dark. Another time I found her in the basement laundry room, just standing there among the boxes of old Christmas decorations, her eyes red from crying. When I asked her what was wrong, she would just shake her head and say she didn't remember how she got there or why she was upset. The amnesia was a convenient explanation for everything. I started noticing that Grace had stopped wearing certain clothes. She had this beautiful blue cardigan that I had bought her for her 65th birthday, her favorite one, and suddenly it disappeared from her rotation. When I asked about it, she got this panicked look on her face and said she must have lost it. Later, I found it stuffed in the back of her closet, and when I pulled it out to show her, she grabbed it from me with surprising force and shoved it back into the darkness. I didn't understand. None of it made sense. There were bruises, too, small ones, usually on her arms. When I would ask her about them, she would look confused and say she must have bumped into something. Given her memory issues and coordination problems, it seemed plausible. The doctors had warned me she might have balance issues, might bump into door frames and furniture. So I accepted that explanation every time. I accepted every explanation that meant I didn't have to confront an uglier truth. The money situation also started getting strange. Grace had a small savings account from an inheritance from her mother, maybe about $8,000 total. It wasn't much, but it was her nest egg, something she had always been proud of maintaining. About 6 months after Brandon moved in, I was reviewing our finances and noticed that the balance had dropped significantly. When I asked Grace about it, she looked confused and said she thought she had bought some things, but she couldn't quite remember what. She mentioned medication costs, maybe some groceries, things for the house. It didn't fully add up, but again, with her memory issues, I figured she was just confused about the amounts, or maybe she had made some purchases she couldn't recall. I made a mental note to keep better track of the accounts, but I didn't pursue it further. Brandon, during all this time, was the model son on the surface. Whenever I was home, he was attentive to Grace. He would ask if she needed anything, offer to help her to the bathroom, bring her tea. He spoke to her gently in front of me, used a patient tone like you might use with a child. He would tell me about his job searches, show me applications he had supposedly filled out. He would complain about how hard the job market was, how companies didn't appreciate real workers anymore. I sympathized with him. I gave him money for gas and food. I told him not to worry about rent, that helping with his mother was contribution enough. At night, after long days of work, I would collapse into bed, exhausted. Sometimes I would hear sounds from downstairs, footsteps, the creak of the basement door, low voices. I told myself it was Brandon getting a snack or watching television. I told myself Grace was probably already asleep. I was too tired to investigate, too tired to question. I just wanted to close my eyes and let sleep take me. This went on for months. Nearly a year of this pattern, me working myself to exhaustion, Brandon playing the devoted son, and Grace sinking deeper into herself. She stopped talking as much. She stopped suggesting we take walks around the neighborhood like we used to. She stopped asking me about my day. When I would try to engage her in conversation, her responses were minimal, distracted. The light in her eyes, that sparkle that had drawn me to her all those years ago, it was fading. The doctors said it was the progression of her condition. That memory loss often came with depression and withdrawal. They adjusted her medications, nothing seemed to help. Then came the incident that should have opened my eyes completely. But even then, I rationalized it away. I came home early one afternoon, maybe 4 months ago now. I had finished a repair job quicker than expected and decided to surprise Grace. Maybe take her out for an ice cream like we used to do on warm days. I parked on the street and walked up to the house, and as I approached the front door, I heard a crash from inside. Not a huge crash, but the distinct sound of something breaking. I hurried inside and found Grace on the floor of the living room, surrounded by pieces of a broken lamp. Brandon was standing over her, and he immediately switched into concerned mode, reaching down to help her up, asking if she was okay. Grace was shaking, actually trembling. Brandon explained that she had been walking past the side table and knocked the lamp over, that he had tried to catch it but wasn't fast enough. He said she had stumbled and fallen, trying to avoid the broken pieces. It was a reasonable explanation. Grace's coordination wasn't great, but something about the scene didn't sit right with me. The way Grace wouldn't look at either of us, the way she almost flinched when Brandon touched her arm to help her up. But he was so calm, so helpful, cleaning up the broken pieces while I got Grace settled on the couch. He even apologized for not watching her more carefully. What kind of monster suspects their own son in that situation? So I didn't. I suspected nothing. The real wake-up call came about 3 weeks ago. I had left the house early in the morning to go to the Union Hall downtown. There were some pension papers I needed to sort out, some paperwork about my old health care coverage that required signatures. It was supposed to take most of the day. With all the bureaucratic back and forth these things always involve. But as it turned out, the person I needed to see had everything ready for me, and I was done by late morning. I decided to just head home rather than find something else to do. I got back to the house around noon. I used my key to come in through the back door off the kitchen, the way I often do when I've been working in the yard or my hands are dirty. I wasn't trying to be quiet particularly, but I wasn't announcing myself either. I set my keys on the counter and was about to call out that I was home when I heard Brandon's voice coming from the front part of the house. Something in his tone stopped me cold. It wasn't the voice of my son. It was harsh, cruel, filled with a venom I had never heard from him before. I stood frozen in the kitchen, barely breathing, and listened. Brandon was yelling, not quite screaming, but loud enough that I could hear every word clearly. He was telling Grace to shut up. He called her useless, a burden. He said horrible things about her memory loss, mocking her confusion. The words were so ugly, so deliberately cruel. He told her she should have died in the accident, that she was nothing but a weight around everyone's neck. He said I was killing myself working to support what he called a living corpse who couldn't even remember her own name. each word felt like a physical blow to me, standing there in my own kitchen, hearing my son speak to my wife this way. I heard Grace crying softly, and then Brandon's voice got even more menacing. He was threatening her, telling her that if she made any noise when I got home, if she complained about anything or seemed upset, he would lock her in the basement. He said he had done it before, and he would do it again. My mind raced back to all those times I had found her in strange places, her eyes red from crying. The bathroom, the laundry room. Had he been locking her away, keeping her prisoner in her own home while I was out working to provide for us? I wanted to storm in there. Every fiber of my being wanted to grab my son and throw him out of my house immediately. But something held me back. Maybe it was the years of working with complex electrical systems where one wrong move could cause catastrophic damage. Maybe it was instinct, but I knew that if I confronted him right then, with just my word against his, he could twist everything. He could say Grace was confused, that she was mistaken, that her memory problems made her imagine things. He had already built such a perfect facade as the caring son. Who would people believe? So I stayed quiet. I listened, and what I heard next made my blood run even colder. Brandon's phone rang, and he answered it. His tone changed completely, became casual, almost jovial. He was talking to someone about sports betting, about how much he owed to some bookie. Then he laughed, actually laughed, and started bragging about how he was getting money. He talked about Grace like she was an ATM machine. He explained to whoever was on the phone how easy it was to manipulate someone with memory problems. He would tell Grace that I had called and said to give him money for her medication or for house repairs or for groceries. She would hand over the cash without question because she trusted family and because she couldn't remember well enough to verify if I had actually called or not. He said he had already taken about $2,000 from her account just that month. $2,000. No wonder her savings were disappearing. I stood there in my kitchen, my hands gripping the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. This was my son, my own flesh and blood, the baby I had held in the hospital, the boy I had taught to ride a bike and throw a baseball, the young man I had helped move into his first apartment. How had he become this? How had I not seen it? I waited until I heard him go upstairs, and then I quietly left the house the same way I had entered. I sat in my truck parked down the street for probably an hour, my mind racing. I was 70 years old. I had worked hard my entire life, tried to be a good man, a good husband, a good father, and this was happening under my own roof. My wife was being tortured by our own son, and I had been too blind and too tired to see it. The rage I felt was unlike anything I had experienced before, but underneath the rage was something even more powerful. Guilt. Soul-crushing guilt. Grace had been suffering for months, maybe longer, and I hadn't protected her. I had brought this predator into our home. I had left her alone with him day after day. I had believed his lies and his performance. I had failed her in the most fundamental way. I knew I needed to be smart about this. I needed documentation. I needed proof that couldn't be disputed or explained away. So I started planning. First, I installed a small camera in the living room, hidden in a bookshelf. I told Brandon it was a new clock I had picked up at a yard sale. He didn't think twice about it. Then I started coming home at unexpected times, varying my schedule. I made excuses about why I was home early or taking half days. Brandon started looking nervous, and I could see him trying to figure out my pattern. Over the next week, that camera captured everything. Brandon yelling at Grace when he thought I was at work. Brandon taking money from her purse while telling her I had requested it. Brandon grabbing her roughly by the arm and shoving her toward the stairs. Brandon eating his dinner while Grace sat hungry because he had told her she had already eaten, and she believed him. Brandon mocking her confusion, laughing at her when she couldn't remember simple things. Every moment was documented, every act of cruelty preserved in digital format. But I needed more than just video. I needed medical documentation. I needed an authority figure to witness what was happening to Grace. So I made an appointment with Dr. Miller, the neurologist who had been treating Grace since the accident. Dr. Jonathan Miller was a good man, someone I had come to respect during the months of Grace's treatment. He was thorough, compassionate, and he actually listened. I called his office and explained that I needed an urgent appointment for Grace, that I had concerns about her progress. The appointment was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. Brandon, always playing his role perfectly, insisted on coming along. He said he wanted to make sure his mother got the best care, that he wanted to hear what the doctor had to say. I agreed because I needed him there. I needed the doctor to see the dynamic between them. We drove to the medical office in downtown Chicago, one of those modern buildings with glass and steel and pristine waiting rooms that smell like antiseptic and expensive coffee. Grace sat between Brandon and me, and I watched her body language carefully. She was pressed against my side, as far from Brandon as she could get in the seat. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. Brandon kept up his performance, asking if she was comfortable, offering to get her water, speaking in that gentle tone he used in public. In the waiting room, I noticed other things too. When the nurse called Grace's name, Brandon stood up immediately, moving to help her out of her chair, even though she didn't need help. But she actually recoiled slightly from his touch before catching herself. The nurse noticed. I saw her glance at Brandon with a flicker of something in her eyes. Suspicion, maybe, or recognition. We went into the examination room together, all three of us. Dr. Miller greeted us warmly, shaking hands, asking how everyone was doing. He started with his usual questions for Grace, checking her cognitive function, asking her to remember strings of numbers, to identify objects, to recall details from previous visits. Grace was having a bad day. She struggled with things she had been able to do in previous appointments. She seemed distracted, anxious. Dr. Miller noticed too. He was good at reading people, I realized. He watched Grace's eyes, watched where they went, watched how she responded, not just with her words, but with her entire body. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He asked Brandon if he wouldn't mind stepping out to the waiting room for a few minutes. He said he needed to do a more private examination, some questions of a personal nature that Grace might be more comfortable answering without family present. He phrased it in a way that sounded completely routine and professional. Brandon hesitated. I could see him trying to figure out if this was normal, if he should object. But refusing would have seemed strange, would have broken his character as the caring son. So he agreed, gave Grace a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and left the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click. The change in Grace was immediate and dramatic. Her entire body seemed to collapse inward. She started crying, not loud sobs, but quiet, desperate tears that broke my heart into pieces. Dr. Miller moved closer, his voice gentle but firm. He told Grace she was safe, that whatever she told him would be protected by doctor-patient confidentiality, that he was there to help her. And then it all came out. Everything. Words tumbling over each other, disjointed and scattered because of her memory issues, but the truth clear and undeniable underneath. Grace told Dr. Miller about the verbal abuse, about being called names, being mocked for her condition, being told she was worthless and better off dead. She talked about Brandon taking money from her, sometimes demanding it, sometimes taking it from her purse when she wasn't looking. She described being pushed, being grabbed too roughly, being handled in ways that left bruises. She talked about being locked in rooms, the bathroom door locked from the outside for hours while I was at work, the basement door at the top of the stairs locked so she couldn't come up. She talked about being denied food as punishment for forgetting things or for looking upset when I came home. She talked about him threatening to hurt her more if she told me anything, about him saying no one would believe her anyway because of her memory problems, that everyone would think she was just confused or imagining things. She talked about living in constant fear, about spending her days trying to be invisible, trying not to provoke him, trying to remember enough to avoid making him angry. Dr. Miller took notes, detailed, careful notes. He asked specific questions. When did the abuse start? How often did it happen? What were the exact nature of the threats? He examined her arms where the bruises were, documented their location and approximate age. He asked about her mental state, her sleep patterns, her eating habits. Everything was recorded in her medical file. Official documentation, proof. Then he turned to me. He asked me what I had witnessed, what I knew. I told him everything. The camera footage I had collected, the conversation I had overheard where Brandon had verbally attacked her and bragged about stealing from her, the changes in Grace's behavior that I had noticed but failed to understand, my own guilt at not seeing it sooner, at leaving her alone with him day after day. Dr. Miller was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then he said something I will never forget. He told me that Grace's brain was trying to heal from the trauma of the accident, but that it couldn't heal in an environment of constant stress and fear. He explained that psychological trauma was physically impacting her recovery, that the parts of her brain responsible for memory and cognitive function were being actively damaged by the ongoing abuse. He said that if I wanted to save my wife, if I wanted to give her any chance at recovery, I needed to remove Brandon from our home immediately. Not in a week, not in a month, immediately. He also told me that what Brandon was doing constituted elder abuse, that Grace, due to her cognitive impairment, was considered a vulnerable adult under Illinois law, that he was legally obligated to report the abuse to Adult Protective Services, that there would be an investigation, that I needed to decide right then whether I was going to protect my wife or protect my son, because I couldn't do both. It wasn't really a decision at all. Not anymore. Maybe it would have been harder if I hadn't heard Brandon's voice that day, dripping with cruelty and contempt. Maybe it would have been harder if I hadn't seen the footage of him tormenting her, but I had seen it all. I knew what he was. So I told Dr. Miller to make the report. I told him I would handle Brandon myself. We brought Brandon back into the room for the end of the appointment. Dr. Miller was professional, discussing Grace's treatment plan, adjusting medications, scheduling follow-ups. Brandon nodded along, asking questions, playing his part. I sat there watching him perform, marveling at how good he was at it. How convincing. If I didn't know better, I would have believed he cared. The drive home was tense. Grace sat silently, staring out the window. Brandon made small talk that I didn't really respond to. My mind was focused on what I needed to do, how I was going to do it. I had to be careful. Brandon was bigger than me, stronger. He had already shown he was capable of violence against someone weaker. I didn't know what he might do if he felt cornered. We got home around 5 in the evening. I told Grace I needed her to go upstairs and pack a small bag, that she was going to stay with Sarah for a few days. I made it sound casual, like it was just a visit. Grace understood, though. I could see in her eyes that she knew something was about to happen. She went upstairs without argument. Brandon was in the kitchen making himself a sandwich, acting like everything was normal, like he hadn't spent the past year terrorizing his own mother. I stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. This was my son, my boy. But he wasn't a boy anymore. He was a 40-year-old man who had chosen to prey on someone vulnerable, who had chosen cruelty over kindness, who had taken advantage of his mother's illness for his own gain. I told him we needed to talk. He could hear something in my voice, I think, something that made him wary. But he followed me into the living room, still holding his sandwich, still trying to maintain that casual attitude. I sat down in my chair, the one I had sat in for decades, the one with the worn armrest from years of use. Brandon sat on the couch across from me. I told him I knew everything. Every word was measured, calm. I told him about the day I had come home early and heard him berating Grace. I told him about the camera footage I had collected. I told him about the financial record showing money disappearing from Grace's account. I told him about the conversation I'd had with Dr. Miller and the formal report being filed with Adult Protective Services. I laid it all out, fact by fact, piece of evidence by piece of evidence. I watched his face as I spoke, watched the mask start to crack. First confusion, like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Then anger, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing. Then calculation, trying to figure out how to talk his way out of this. Finally, something else. Something cold and hard. The real Brandon underneath all the performance. And there was no remorse there, no shame, no guilt. Just anger that he had been caught, just resentment that his scheme had been exposed. He tried to defend himself at first, tried to say I was misunderstanding, that Grace was confused, that her memory problems made her unreliable. He tried to say he had been helping, that I didn't understand how hard it was to take care of someone with her condition. He tried to shift blame, saying I was never around, that I had left him to deal with everything alone, each excuse more desperate than the last. But when he realized I wasn't budging, when he saw that I had actual proof and wasn't going to be manipulated or gaslit, the facade dropped completely. The angry words came pouring out. He called Grace names, terrible names. He said she was a burden, a waste of space, that she deserved what she got. He said he had a right to that money, that he was owed something for putting up with living in this house, for dealing with a brain-damaged woman all day. He actually used those words. Brain-damaged. Like she was less than human because of her injury. He stood up, getting aggressive, pacing the room, raising his voice, trying to intimidate me the way he had been intimidating Grace. But I wasn't Grace. I wasn't confused or vulnerable or dependent on him. I was a 71-year-old man who had spent 4 decades doing physical labor, who still had strength in these old arms, who had finally seen the truth and wasn't going to look away anymore. I stood up too. I told him he had until morning to pack his things and get out. I told him that if I ever saw him within a block of this house again, if he ever tried to contact Grace, if he ever came near either of us, I would not only press charges with the police, but I would make sure everyone knew what he had done, his friends, his potential employers, anyone who would listen. I told him I had copies of the camera footage saved in multiple places. I told him Dr. Miller's report was already filed and couldn't be undone. I told him I was done protecting him, done making excuses for him, done hoping he would become someone he clearly had no intention of being. The look he gave me was pure hatred. He said some things I won't repeat. Threats and accusations and vile words. He knocked over a chair on his way out of the room, slammed his way up the stairs. I heard him in his bedroom, throwing things around, making as much noise as possible. I just stood there in the living room, my heart pounding, my hands shaking with adrenaline. Grace came downstairs with her small bag. Sarah had already pulled up outside. I had texted her during the appointment to come get her mother. Grace looked at me with tears in her eyes, and for the first time in months, there was something else there, too. Hope, maybe, or relief. She reached out and squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back. Then I walked her out to Sarah's car. Sarah wanted to know what was happening. I gave her the short version. Her face went pale, then red with anger. She wanted to go in and confront Brandon herself. I told her no. I told her the best thing she could do was take care of her mother, keep her safe, let me handle this. Sarah is like me in some ways, practical and protective. She understood. She got in her car with Grace and drove away, and I went back inside to wait. Brandon came down 2 hours later with 2 duffel bags and a backpack. He didn't say a word to me, just walked out the front door and got into his beat-up old Honda. He sat there in the driveway for a few minutes, engine running, and I wondered if he was going to come back in, if this was going to escalate. But eventually he backed out and drove away. I watched his tail lights disappear down the street, and then I locked every door and window in the house. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the street, half expecting him to come back, making sure he didn't try to break in. But he didn't come back that night, or the next night, or any night after that. The next few weeks were a blur of legal and medical appointments. Adult Protective Services did their investigation. They interviewed Grace, interviewed me, reviewed Dr. Miller's report and the camera footage. They confirmed the abuse. They added Brandon's name to the State Registry of Elder Abusers. They helped me get a protective order that legally barred him from coming within 500 feet of Grace or our property. The police got involved, too. There was talk of pressing criminal charges for theft and elder abuse. I went back and forth on that. Part of me wanted him prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Part of me just wanted him gone and out of our lives forever. In the end, I decided not to push for criminal charges. not because he didn't deserve it, but because I knew Grace couldn't handle going through a trial, reliving everything in court, being cross-examined by lawyers. It would have destroyed the progress she was making, because she was making progress, amazing progress. Within a week of Brandon leaving, Grace was different. The constant tension in her body started to ease. She began sleeping through the night again. Her appetite returned. She started talking more, engaging with the world around her. She moved back home after 2 weeks at Sarah's place, and we started rebuilding our life together. Dr. Miller said it was remarkable. He said he had seen it before in patients, how removing a source of constant stress could jumpstart recovery in ways medication never could. Grace's memory didn't come flooding back overnight. It was gradual, piece by piece. But it came back. She started remembering more from day to day. Her cognitive tests improved. The fog that had seemed so permanent started to lift. Now, here I am a year later, and Grace is about 75% back to who she was. She still has gaps in her memory, times when things are fuzzy or blank, but she can hold conversations, remember what happened yesterday, recognize everyone in her life. She cooks again. Simple things at first, but now more complex recipes. She tends to her flowers in the backyard, those petunias she always loved. She laughs again, real laughter, not the nervous, uncertain sound she made when Brandon was here. She's learning to trust the world again, to feel safe in her own home. Hey, quick pause here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Leave a comment telling me your location. It's always amazing to see this community from all over the world. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Your support means everything and helps me continue telling stories that matter. Sarah comes over every weekend now. Sometimes she brings her husband Tom, and we all have dinner together. Those evenings are precious to me. Sitting around the table with my daughter and my wife, the three of us talking and laughing, making new memories to replace the ones that were tainted. Sarah has become even closer to her mother through all of this. She calls every day to check in. She takes Grace to doctor's appointments when I can't. The bond between them has grown stronger, forged in the fire of what we went through. As for Brandon, I don't know where he is. He called once about 2 months after he left. It was late at night, and I could tell he had been drinking. He was crying, saying he was sorry, saying he wanted to come home. He said he was struggling, that he had nowhere to go, that he needed help. Part of me, the part that remembered holding him as a baby, wanted to believe him, wanted to think he had genuinely hit rock bottom and was ready to change. But I had learned my lesson about giving him chances, about believing his words over his actions. I told him he needed to get help on his own. I gave him the number for a local mental health clinic that offered services on a sliding scale. I told him if he got serious about treatment, if he worked on himself for a sustained period with proof of progress, maybe someday far in the future we could talk. But that Grace would never be around him again. That was non-negotiable. He hung up on me. I haven't heard from him since. I don't know if he ever called that clinic. I don't know if he's homeless or if he found somewhere to stay. I don't know if he's alive or dead. And the honest truth, the truth that makes me feel guilty sometimes, is that I don't want to know. That probably sounds cold. What kind of father gives up on his son completely? What kind of man turns his back on his own child? These are questions I ask myself sometimes, usually late at night when sleep won't come. But then I think about Grace. I think about what she went through. I think about how close we came to losing her entirely, not to the car accident, but to the slow, insidious destruction of her spirit by someone she trusted. And I remember that my first duty was to protect her, is to protect her, will always be to protect her. And I failed that duty for too long because I wanted to believe in a son who didn't exist. The Brandon I thought I knew, the boy I raised, the man I hoped he would become, that person is not real. Maybe he never was. Maybe I created a version of him in my head that I wanted to see, and I ignored all the evidence to the contrary. Or maybe something broke in him along the way, some essential piece of empathy or humanity that makes people treat each other with basic decency. I'll never know, and I've had to make peace with that. There's this idea in our society that family is everything. Blood is thicker than water. You stand by your family no matter what. I believed that for most of my life. But I learned the hard way that family isn't just about biology. It's about how you treat each other. It's about respect and care and protection. Brandon shared my DNA, but he stopped being family when he chose to terrorize a vulnerable woman for his own gain, when he chose cruelty over compassion, when he chose to take advantage of his mother's illness instead of helping her heal. Real family is Grace, still here with me, tending her garden and baking pies that sometimes turn out perfect and sometimes don't. But she tries anyway. Real family is Sarah, who drops everything when we need her, who calls to check in not out of obligation, but out of genuine love. Real family is Dr. Miller, who took the time to really see what was happening and gave me the tools to protect my wife. Real family is the neighbors who noticed we seemed happier and asked if everything was okay, who offered help without prying. Family is built on trust and action, not on shared genetic code. I'm 72 now. I don't work as much as I used to. I take on the occasional contract job when we need extra money, but mostly I'm here at home with Grace. We've fallen into new routines. Morning coffee on the back porch when the weather is nice. Slow walks around Bridgeport. Grace pointing out houses she remembers from before, telling stories that come back to her bit by bit. Evening news together, her hand in mine. Simple things, quiet things. But these quiet things feel like miracles after what we've been through. Sometimes I catch Grace looking at me with this expression I can't quite read. When I ask her what she's thinking, she says she's grateful. Grateful that I believed her. Grateful that I acted. Grateful that she's safe. She apologizes sometimes for the trouble, for the burden she thinks she's been. I tell her every time that she has nothing to apologize for, that she is not a burden, that she is the reason I get up every morning and the reason I'm glad to come home every night. There are hard days still, days when the memory loss frustrates her, when she can't find words or can't remember something important. Days when the trauma comes back in nightmares or flashbacks. Days when she sees someone on the street who vaguely resembles Brandon and she tenses up, moving closer to me for safety. On those days, I hold her hand tighter. I remind her where she is. I remind her she's safe. I remind her that I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. I've learned things about myself through this ordeal. I learned that I can be too trusting, that my desire to see the best in people can blind me to dangerous realities. I learned that being a provider isn't the same as being a protector, that sometimes you need to be present and vigilant, not just working and hoping for the best. I learned that confronting ugly truths, even about people you love, is sometimes the only path forward. I learned that standing up to family, cutting off family when necessary, doesn't make you heartless. Sometimes it makes you the only thing standing between someone vulnerable and complete destruction. The guilt doesn't fully go away. Even now, a year later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night thinking about all the months Grace suffered while I was oblivious. All the times I could have questioned things more carefully. All the signs I missed or rationalized away. The camera footage I have saved, stored away in a folder I will probably never look at again, captures moments I can't forget. Grace's face, confused and frightened. Brandon's face, twisted with contempt. The truth of what was happening in my house while I convinced myself everything was fine. But wallowing in that guilt doesn't help anyone. Dr. Miller told me that early on. He said the guilt is natural, but dwelling on it endlessly is selfish, in a way. It makes the situation about my feelings instead of about moving forward and healing. So I try to channel that guilt into action, into being the husband and father I should have been all along, into making sure Grace knows every single day that she is valued, loved, and protected, into being present and aware in ways I wasn't before. The house feels different now, lighter somehow. I know that sounds strange, like I'm being overly dramatic, but I swear the actual air feels different. Grace says she feels it too. The oppressive weight that hung over everything, that invisible tension, it's gone. The house is ours again, not a prison, not a place of fear, just a home where two people who have loved each other for decades are growing old together. We've made some changes to the house. New paint in the living room, a brighter color that Grace picked out. New locks on all the doors, better ones, stronger ones. Not that I expect Brandon to come back, but for Grace's peace of mind. She needed to know she was secure. We replaced that broken lamp with a new one Grace found at an antique shop. A Tiffany-style piece with colored glass that throws patterns on the wall when the light is on. We cleaned out Brandon's old room completely, gave his things to charity, and turned it into a craft room for Grace. She's taken up watercolors as part of her therapy, painting simple scenes and flowers. She's actually quite good. Sarah's been encouraging us to think about the future, about what happens as we both get older. She's suggested we might want to consider moving into a smaller place, maybe a condo with less maintenance, or even assisted living down the line when we need more support. Grace and I talk about it sometimes, but for now, we want to stay here. This is where we built our life together. This is where our good memories live. This is where we fought for our life back and won. We're not ready to leave yet. The legal side of things is mostly settled now. The protective order is permanent. Brandon's name is on the state registry. The money he stole is written off, not worth pursuing legally, according to our lawyer. It would cost more in legal fees than we would recover. Besides, it's not really about the money. It never was. It was about power and control and cruelty. The money was just a symptom. I did report the full extent of the financial theft to the credit bureaus and fraud prevention services just to make sure Brandon can't somehow use Grace's information to open accounts or take out loans. I've set up better protections on all our accounts, added extra verification requirements. I monitor everything now, check the statements weekly. I won't be blindsided again. Sometimes people in the neighborhood ask about Brandon, where he is, how he's doing. I keep my answers vague. He moved out. He's living elsewhere. We're not in close contact. Most people don't push further. I think some of them sense there's a difficult story there and don't want to pry. The few who know what really happened, mostly Sarah's husband Tom, who helped me install security cameras around the exterior of the house. They don't ask. They know. There was one moment a few months ago that nearly broke me. Grace and I were looking through old photo albums, something we do sometimes to help trigger her memories. We came across pictures from Brandon's childhood. Him on his first day of kindergarten, him at his high school graduation, him and me at a Cubs game, both of us wearing matching jerseys and ridiculous grins. I saw Grace's face as she looked at those photos, saw the confusion there, trying to reconcile the smiling boy in the pictures with the man who had tortured her. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes and asked where that little boy went. How did he become what he became? I didn't have an answer. I still don't. Nature versus nurture, bad influences, bad choices, mental illness, fundamental character flaws, who knows? Maybe it was a combination of everything. Maybe there's no one reason. But at some point, regardless of the cause, a person has to be held responsible for their actions, especially when those actions are deliberate and sustained and designed to hurt someone weaker. I think about the fact that if I hadn't come home early that day, if I hadn't overheard Brandon, I might never have known. He might have continued indefinitely. The abuse might have escalated. Grace's condition might have deteriorated to the point of no return. She might have had another breakdown, might have ended up institutionalized. She might have died, her death attributed to complications from the accident, when really it would have been caused by the ongoing trauma she was experiencing. That alternate timeline haunts me sometimes. How close we came to losing everything. But we didn't lose everything. We survived, Grace survived, our marriage survived, and in some ways, we're stronger now than we were before. Not because the trauma was good or worth it, God no, but because we fought through it together. Because I finally stepped up and protected my wife the way I should have been protecting her all along. Because Grace found the courage to speak up to Dr. Miller. Because we both decided that surviving wasn't enough. We wanted to actually live. I've started going to a support group for caregivers of people with traumatic brain injuries. It meets Tuesday evenings at a community center near Midway. At first, I went mostly because Dr. Miller suggested it, but I've found it genuinely helpful. Hearing other people's stories, sharing some of mine. Not all of it. I don't go into the abuse details, but I talk about the challenges of helping Grace recover and rebuild. The other people in the group understand in ways that even well-meaning friends don't. They know what it's like to watch someone you love struggle with memory and cognition. They know the small victories and the frustrating setbacks. One guy in the group, Frank, his wife had a stroke 5 years ago. He told me once that the key to being a good caregiver is remembering that you're not just maintaining their existence, you're trying to help them find joy again. That stuck with me. So I try to do that. I try to find moments of joy for Grace every day. A favorite meal, a TV show she likes, a walk to the lake, a call with Sarah, a new flower blooming in the garden. Small things that add up to a life worth living. Grace goes to a support group, too, for brain injury survivors. She missed the first few meetings because of anxiety, But Sarah started going with her, and that helped. Now Grace goes on her own, takes the bus there and back. That independence, that ability to navigate the city by herself again, was a huge milestone. The first time she went alone, I was anxious the entire time she was gone. But she came home safely, proud of herself, and I realized I needed to trust in her recovery. Trust that she's stronger than I give her credit for. We celebrated our anniversary last month. 47 years together. It's a strange milestone to celebrate given everything that happened, but we wanted to mark it anyway. Sarah took us out to dinner at a nice Italian restaurant in Little Italy, and we toasted to surviving, to healing, to the years ahead. Grace gave a little speech, which was hard for her because she still sometimes struggles with finding words. But she managed. She talked about how grateful she was to still be here, to have a husband who stood by her and a daughter who loved her. There wasn't a dry eye at the table. Looking back on everything now, on this whole nightmare that became our life for a year, I see it as a harsh lesson in the importance of vigilance, of trusting your instincts even when they point to something you don't want to believe, of putting the safety of vulnerable people first even when it means devastating choices. I failed Grace for a long time, but I didn't fail her in the end. I found the courage to act, and that action saved her life, saved our life together. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a hero. I did what any decent human being should do, which is protect someone who couldn't protect themselves. I just wish I had done it sooner. But I'm also learning to forgive myself for the time I lost, the time she suffered. Beating myself up endlessly about it doesn't change the past. All I can do is be better moving forward. If there's anything I want people to take away from my story, it's this: pay attention. If something feels wrong, investigate. Don't explain away signs of abuse just because you don't want to believe someone you love could be capable of such things. People are capable of incredible cruelty, sometimes especially toward those who are most vulnerable. Family members, caregivers, people in positions of trust, they're often the perpetrators of elder abuse and abuse of disabled individuals. It's uncomfortable to acknowledge, but it's true. And if you're reading this and you're in a situation similar to what I was in, where you suspect someone you love is being mistreated, but you're afraid to confront it, please find the courage to act. Talk to doctors. Document everything. Reach out to adult protective services or similar agencies in your area. You might save someone's life. You might give them back a future they thought was lost. There are still hard days, days when the weight of what happened feels overwhelming, days when I look at myself in the mirror and see a 72-year-old man who failed to protect his wife when she needed him most. Days when I wonder if Brandon ever thinks about what he did, if he feels any remorse, if he's out there somewhere suffering or thriving. But those days are fewer now. Most days are just days. Simple, quiet, ordinary days with my wife. And after everything we've been through, ordinary feels like a blessing. Grace is calling me from the kitchen. She's made lemonade, wants to sit on the porch with me before the afternoon heat sets in. These little moments, these tiny slices of normalcy and peace, they're everything to me now. They're what I fought for. They're what I'll keep fighting for as long as I draw breath. My name is Arthur Sterling. I'm a 72-year-old retired railway worker from Chicago. I've been married to the love of my life for 47 years. I have one daughter who makes me proud every day. And I had a son who I had to cut out of my life to save my family. That's my story. It's not a happy story, not entirely, but it's a true one. And if it helps even one person recognize abuse in their own life or find the courage to stand up and say, enough is enough, then maybe all this pain had some purpose after all. So, where are you watching this from? What's your story? Drop a comment below and let me know if this resonated with you. And thank you for listening to an old man share the hardest chapter of his life. It means more than you know.